There is a face in the desert that has been staring east for more than 4,500 years. It is carved from a single ridge of limestone bedrock, shaped into the form of a creature that does not exist. The body of a lion, the head of a man. It is roughly 73 meters long, roughly 20 meters high, and it sits in a shallow depression on the Giza Plateau, flanked by the most famous pyramids on Earth. Its nose is missing. Its beard has fallen. Its surface is scarred by millennia of wind, sand, and rain, and yet the face endures, weathered, damaged, incomplete, but unmistakably human, unmistakably watching, unmistakably waiting. The Great Sphinx of Giza is the largest monolith sculpture in the ancient world. It is the oldest known monumental sculpture in Egypt. It has been buried to its shoulders in sand, excavated, reburied, and excavated again more times than any other monument in the country. It has been the subject of more speculation, more mythology, more conspiracy theorizing, and more scholarly debate than any other single artifact of the ancient world. And yet, after more than 2 centuries of systematic archaeological investigation, the most basic questions about the Sphinx remain contested. Who built it? When was it carved? What was its original purpose? And whose face does it wear? The conventional answer, the answer accepted by the majority of Egyptologists, is that the Sphinx was carved during the reign of the pharaoh Khafre, the 4th king of Egypt's Fourth Dynasty, sometime around 2530 BC. The evidence for this attribution is circumstantial but substantial. The Sphinx sits directly adjacent to Khafre's Valley Temple. The causeway leading from Khafre's pyramid appears to have been designed with the Sphinx's enclosure in mind, and the face of the Sphinx, according to some forensic analyses, bears a resemblance to the known portraits of Khafre, particularly the magnificent diorite statue found in his Valley Temple, which depicts the pharaoh seated on a throne with the falcon god Horus spreading its wings behind his head. But the attribution is not unanimous. A persistent minority of scholars has argued that the Sphinx predates Khafre, that it was carved earlier, perhaps during the reign of Khufu or even during an earlier dynasty, and that Khafre merely adopted it, incorporating it into his funerary complex as a pre-existing feature of the landscape. The debate is technical, contentious, and unresolved, and it goes to the heart of a larger mystery. Who was Khafre, and why has his identity become so entangled with the most enigmatic monument on Earth? The numbers are striking. Khafre's pyramid, the second of the 3 great pyramids at Giza, is often mistaken for the largest because it sits on higher ground than his father Khufu's Great Pyramid and retains a substantial cap of original limestone casing at its summit. Its base measures roughly 215 meters on each side. Its original height was roughly 143 meters, only 3 meters shorter than the Great Pyramid. Its volume is estimated at roughly 2.2 million cubic meters. It is, by any measure, one of the most impressive buildings in the ancient world. And yet Khafre is remembered not for his pyramid but for a face carved into the living rock, staring eastward across the Nile Valley, that may or may not be his own. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who Khafre was, not just as the possible builder of the Sphinx, but as a pharaoh who ruled at the absolute peak of Egyptian civilization, who inherited a construction tradition at its most refined, and who left behind a funerary complex that rivals his father's in ambition and surpasses it in certain dimensions of artistic achievement. You are going to see the Sphinx as the archaeologists see it, not as a mystery to be solved by speculation, but as a monument embedded in a specific archaeological context, yielding specific evidence subject to specific interpretations. And you are going to confront the unsettling possibility that the most famous face in the ancient world belongs to a man we barely know. Khafre is the pharaoh caught between 2 legends. His father, Khufu, built the Great Pyramid, the largest and most famous building on Earth. His possible successor, Menkaure, built the smallest of the 3 Giza pyramids, but left behind some of the most exquisite sculpture of the Old Kingdom. Khafre stands between them, the middle king of the middle generation, overshadowed by the monuments on either side of his own. And yet his legacy may be the most enduring of all, because if the Sphinx is his, if that colossal face carved from the living rock is indeed the face of Khafre, Then he left behind not just a pyramid, but an icon. An image so powerful, so haunting, so instantly recognizable that it has become the face of ancient Egypt itself. The question is whether the face is his. The question has been asked for 2 centuries, and the question remains unanswered. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let us begin. The Fourth Dynasty of Egypt, the dynasty of Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, was the most concentrated period of monumental construction in human history. In the span of roughly from approximately 2600 to 2500 BC, 4 successive pharaohs built at least 9 major pyramids, along with mortuary temples, valley temples, causeways, subsidiary pyramids, and the Sphinx itself. The volume of stone quarried, transported, and placed during this century exceeds the total volume of stone used in monumental construction by any other civilization in any other comparable period. The Fourth Dynasty was not just the golden age of Egyptian architecture, it was the golden age of human construction, full stop. Khafre occupied the middle of this extraordinary period. He was the son of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, and the father, or possibly the brother, of Menkaure, the builder of the Third Giza Pyramid. His precise position in the royal succession is debated. The traditional king list places Khafre as the direct successor of Khufu, but most modern scholars believe that at least one pharaoh, Djedefre, another son of Khufu, reigned between them. Djedefre moved the royal cemetery from Giza to Abu Rawash, about 8 kilometers to the north, where he began construction of his own pyramid. The pyramid was never completed, or was deliberately dismantled after his death, and the circumstances of Djedefre's reign and its end remain obscure. When Khafre came to power, he made a decisive choice. He returned to Giza, building his pyramid on the same plateau where his father had built the Great Pyramid, reasserting the family's claim to the most prestigious burial site in Egypt. This decision, to build at Giza rather than at a new site, was both political and theological. By placing his pyramid adjacent to his father's, Khafre was declaring continuity of dynasty, continuity of authority, continuity of the divine kingship that justified the entire pyramid-building enterprise. The choice was not just practical, it was a statement. Khafre was not starting something new, he was continuing something that his father had begun. And he was doing so on the same ground, under the same sky, within sight of the same monuments. The Egypt that Khafre inherited was, by the standards of the mid-3rd millennium BC, the most powerful state on earth. The central government controlled the agricultural surplus of the entire Nile Valley, a strip of fertile land stretching more than 1,000 kilometers from the first cataract at Aswan to the Mediterranean coast. The bureaucracy that managed this territory was the most sophisticated administrative apparatus in the ancient world, a high hierarchy of scribes, overseers, and officials capable of tracking resources, mobilizing labor, and coordinating construction projects on a scale that no other contemporary society could match. The treasury controlled access to copper from the Sinai, turquoise from the eastern desert, gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, and granite from Aswan. The military, though less prominent in the historical record than in later periods, was capable of projecting power across the borders of Egypt proper into the neighboring regions of Libya, Nubia, and the Sinai Peninsula. This was the state that Khafre commanded, and it was this state, its resources, its labor, its organizational capacity, that he directed toward the construction of the most complete and best preserved funerary complex of the Old Kingdom. Khafre's funerary complex is, in many ways, more impressive than Khufu's. Not because the pyramid is larger, but because more of it has survived. The Great Pyramid's mortuary temple, valley temple, and causeway have been almost entirely destroyed by later quarrying and urban encroachment. Khafre's complex, by contrast, retains significant portions of all 3 elements, providing the most complete picture of how a Fourth Dynasty funerary complex functioned as an integrated architectural whole. The Valley Temple of Khafre is one of the most extraordinary buildings in ancient Egypt. Located at the eastern edge of the Giza Plateau, near the base of the Sphinx, It is built of massive limestone blocks faced with polished red granite from Aswan. The blocks are enormous, some weighing more than 100 tons, and they are fitted together with a precision that rivals the best work at the Great Pyramid. The interior of the temple is austere and magnificent, a T-shaped hall supported by massive square granite pillars, originally lined with more than 20 life-size statues of the king, carved from various hard stones. The floor is paved with alabaster. The walls are bare granite, no inscriptions, no reliefs, no decoration of any kind. The effect is one of overwhelming solidity and permanence, a building that communicates power not through ornament but through sheer mass and material. It was in this valley temple that one of the most famous works of ancient art was discovered. In 1853, the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette was excavating at Giza when his workmen uncovered a pit in the floor of Khafre's Valley Temple. Inside the pit, upside down, was a life-size seated statue of Khafre, carved from a single block of dark grey-green diorite gneiss, one of the hardest stones available to the ancient Egyptians. The statue depicts the pharaoh seated on a throne, his left hand on his knee, his right fist clenched against his chest. Behind his head, the falcon god Horus spreads its wings, enveloping the king's Nemes headdress in a gesture of divine protection. The face is calm, composed, and authoritative, a face that radiates power and serenity in equal measure. The Khafre diorite statue is widely regarded as one of the supreme achievements of ancient Egyptian art. Its craftsmanship is extraordinary. The surface of the diorite is polished to a mirror finish, the anatomical details are rendered with subtle precision, and the composition, the king seated, the god protecting, the whole figure radiating stability and permanence, is a masterpiece of sculptural design. The statue now occupies a prominent position in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where it has served, for more than a century and a half, as one of the defining images of ancient Egyptian civilization. But the statue raises as many questions as it answers. Why was it found upside down in a pit? Was it deliberately buried, ritually decommissioned perhaps, when the temple's function changed, or was it thrown there by vandals, by tomb robbers, or by the agents of a hostile successor? The answer is unknown. The circumstances of the statue's burial are as mysterious as the circumstances of its creation, and the mystery extends to Khafre himself, a pharaoh whose face is preserved in one of the most beautiful sculptures ever made, but whose biography is almost entirely blank. We know the face. We do not know the man. The causeway connecting Khafre's Valley Temple to his mortuary temple, a covered corridor roughly 500 meters long, ascending the slope of the Giza Plateau, has been partially excavated and found to contain traces of relief decoration on its interior walls. These reliefs, now largely destroyed, originally depicted scenes related to the king's funerary rituals, his relationship with the gods, and possibly scenes of daily life in his kingdom. The causeway was roofed and enclosed, creating a dark, narrow passage through which the funeral procession would have passed on its way from the Valley Temple to the Mortuary Temple and the pyramid beyond. The effect was deliberate. The procession moved from the light of the valley, the world of the living, into the darkness of the causeway, the transition between life and death, and emerged at the Mortuary Temple, the threshold of the afterlife. The architecture enacted the theology. The building was the ritual. The Mortuary Temple on the eastern face of Khafre's pyramid is the largest of the Old Kingdom mortuary temples, a complex of courts, halls, and storage rooms covering an area of roughly 110 meters by 50 meters. Its walls, built of massive limestone blocks faced with granite, originally enclosed a series of open courts decorated with statues of the king, offering halls where daily rituals were performed and magazines where the supplies for the funerary cult were stored. The temple has been heavily damaged by later quarrying, but its ground plan has been reconstructed through excavation, and it provides the most complete picture of the architectural program that accompanied a Fourth Dynasty pyramid. The integration of all these elements, the Valley Temple, the Causeway, the Mortuary Temple, the Pyramid, and the Sphinx, into a single coherent architectural program, is what makes Khafre's complex unique among the Giza monuments. Khufu's complex may have been equally elaborate, but too little of it survives to permit comparison. Menkaure's complex is well preserved but smaller. Khafre's complex, with its surviving valley temple, its partially preserved causeway, its reconstructed mortuary temple, and its association with the Sphinx, is the most complete example of Fourth Dynasty royal architecture in existence. It is, in a very real sense, the template, the model against which all other Old Kingdom funerary complexes are measured. The length of Khafre's reign is uncertain. Estimates range from roughly 15 to 26 years, with most scholars favouring a reign of approximately 20 to 25 years. If these estimates are correct, then the construction of Khafre's entire funerary complex, the pyramid, the temples, the causeway, the Sphinx, was accomplished within a single generation. The organisational and logistical demands of such a project, while slightly less than those of the Great Pyramid, were still enormous. Tens of thousands of workers had to be recruited, housed, fed, and organised. Millions of tons of stone had to be quarried, transported, and placed. And the entire operation had to be managed by a bureaucratic apparatus that, while inherited from Khufu, still required constant attention and adjustment. The workforce that built Khafre's complex was drawn from the same pool of labour that had built the Great Pyramid. Many of the skilled workers, the quarrymen, the stonemasons, the surveyors, would have been veterans of Khufu's project, bringing decades of experience to the new construction site. The administrative systems, the scribal records, the supply chains, the work gang organisation were inherited directly from the previous reign. Khafre did not have to build these systems from scratch. He inherited them, already functioning, already proven, already capable of managing construction on a monumental scale. This inheritance is crucial to understanding Khafre's achievement. The Great Pyramid was, in many ways, a pioneer project, the first true pyramid built to the absolute limits of the technology. Khafre's pyramid, while slightly smaller, benefited from all the lessons learned during the Great Pyramid's construction. The foundation preparation was sound. The coursework was regular. The alignment was precise. The internal chambers, while less ambitious than the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber and Grand Gallery, were competently executed. Khafre's builders knew what they were doing. They had done it before. But Khafre did not simply replicate his father's work. He innovated in ways that are less dramatic than the Great Pyramid's engineering achievements, but that reveal a different kind of ambition. Where Khufu's funerary complex emphasized the pyramid itself, the sheer scale and precision of the central monument, Khafre's complex placed greater emphasis on the surrounding structures. The valley temple, the causeway, and the mortuary temple were all larger and more elaborately designed than their counterparts at the Great Pyramid, and the Sphinx, if it is indeed Khafre's creation, added an entirely new element to the funerary landscape, a colossal guardian figure carved from the living rock that watched over the approach to the king's eternal dwelling. This shift in emphasis from the pyramid to the complex may reflect a change in the theology of royal death that was occurring during the Fourth Dynasty. The earlier pyramid builders had focused almost exclusively on the tomb itself, pouring their resources into the construction of the largest and most permanent structure possible. Khafre's generation seems to have broadened its focus, investing not just in the tomb but in the ritual landscape that surrounded it. The result was a more integrated, more theatrical, more experientially powerful complex. A landscape designed not just to house the dead, but to stage the transition from life to death as a dramatic architectural event. The political context of Khafre's accession to the throne deserves closer attention, because it may explain aspects of his building program that are otherwise puzzling. The reign of Giza, who appears to have ruled between Khufu and Khafre, is one of the most mysterious episodes in Fourth Dynasty history. Giza abandoned Giza and built his pyramid at Abu Rawash, a site 8 kilometers to the north that had no previous association with the royal cemetery. His pyramid, if it was ever completed, has been almost entirely destroyed, reduced to a mound of rubble that barely rises above the surrounding desert. The destruction appears to have been deliberate. The granite casing blocks were systematically removed. The core was quarried for building material, and the subterranean chambers were ransacked. Some scholars have interpreted this destruction as evidence of a dynastic conflict, a struggle for the throne between different branches of Khufu's family. in which Djedefre's faction lost and his monuments were deliberately obliterated by the victors. If this interpretation is correct, then Khafre's return to Giza was not just an architectural choice. It was a political statement, a declaration that the legitimate line of succession ran through Khafre, not through Djedefre, and that the royal cemetery at Giza was the proper burial place for the true heirs of Khufu. The construction of the Sphinx, in this context, takes on an additional dimension of meaning. It was not just a religious monument but a political one, a colossal assertion of Khafre's authority carved into the very bedrock of the plateau, too massive to be quarried away by any future rival. This political reading of the Sphinx is speculative, but it is consistent with the evidence. The Sphinx faces east, toward the rising sun, toward the city of Memphis, toward the center of royal power. Its gaze commands the approach to the entire Giza complex. Anyone entering the necropolis from the valley below would have to pass the Sphinx, would have to walk beneath its gaze, under the weight of its authority. Before reaching the pyramids of Khufu and Khafre, the Sphinx was not just a guardian of the dead, it was a gatekeeper of the living, a monument that controlled the experience of approaching the royal cemetery, and that made the authority of the king, who built it, impossible to ignore. The relationship between Khafre and his father Khufu is itself a subject of scholarly debate. Ancient sources offer conflicting portraits. The Westcar Papyrus, a collection of stories dating to the Middle Kingdom, includes a tale in which a magician predicts that a woman will give birth to 3 children who will become kings, a prediction sometimes interpreted as a reference to the Fifth Dynasty pharaohs. The implication is that the Fourth Dynasty's hold on power was not absolute and that rival claimants existed. If the Fourth Dynasty's internal politics were as contentious as some scholars believe, then Khafre's building program at Giza, his pyramid, his temples, his Sphinx, was not just a funerary project, it was a legitimacy project, an overwhelming display of power designed to silence any challenge to his right to rule. The artistic achievement of Khafre's reign is often overshadowed by the engineering achievements of the Fourth Dynasty, but it deserves recognitions in its own right. The diorite statue of Khafre, found in the Valley Temple, is not just a portrait of a king, it is a theological statement rendered in stone. The falcon god Horus, spreading its wings behind the king's head, identifies Khafre as the living incarnation of the deity, the earthly form of the god of kingship, protected and empowered by the divine force that animates all legitimate rulers. The choice of material is itself significant. Diorite gneiss is one of the hardest stones available to the ancient Egyptians, extraordinarily difficult to carve and virtually indestructible once finished. The use of this material for the king's portrait was a statement about permanence, the same statement made by the pyramid itself, expressed in a different medium. The Valley Temple originally contained more than 20 such statues, positioned in the granite-pillared hall like sentries guarding the entrance to the afterlife. Most of these statues have been lost or destroyed. The diorite statue survived only because it was thrown into a pit, perhaps deliberately buried during a period of political or religious upheaval, perhaps discarded by tomb robbers who found it too heavy to move. Mariette's discovery of the statue in 1853 was one of the defining moments of early Egyptology, a moment when the artistic achievement of the Old Kingdom was revealed in its full, breathtaking power. The scale of the blocks used in Khafre's Valley Temple has attracted the attention of engineers as well as archaeologists. Some of the core blocks weigh more than 100 tons, comparable to the largest blocks in any ancient structure. The technique used to quarry, transport, and place these blocks is not fully understood, though it is presumed to involve the same methods used in the construction of the pyramids. Copper tools, wooden levers, sledges, and manpower. The fact that blocks of this size were used in a temple rather than in the pyramid itself suggests that Khafre's builders placed as much importance on the surrounding structures as on the central monument, a further indication of the shift in emphasis that characterized Khafre's building program. The pyramid itself, while less famous than the Great Pyramid, is a masterpiece of Fourth Dynasty engineering. Its base, roughly 215 meters on each side, is level to within a few centimeters. Its alignment to the cardinal points is precise. Its internal chambers, simpler than the Great Pyramid's elaborate system of passages and chambers, include a burial chamber cut into the bedrock, accessed by a descending passage from the north face. The granite sarcophagus, found in the burial chamber by Giovanni Belzoni in 1818, was empty, robbed in antiquity, like every other royal tomb in Egypt. The lid was found on the floor beside the sarcophagus, broken. Animal bones were found inside the sarcophagus, the remains of a bull sacrifice, perhaps, or the detritus of later occupation by animals that had found their way into the chamber through the open passage. Belzoni's exploration of Khafre's pyramid was one of the early milestones of Egyptology. The Italian explorer, a former circus strongman turned antiquarian, had travelled to Egypt in search of antiquities and had focused his attention on the Giza Plateau. His entry into Khafre's pyramid, achieved by locating the original entrance on the north face and clearing the debris that blocked it, was a moment of genuine discovery, though the empty sarcophagus that awaited him must have been a disappointment. Belzoni left his name and the date of his entry inscribed on the wall of the burial chamber, where it can still be seen today, a piece of archaeological vandalism that nevertheless provides useful evidence for the state of the pyramid at the time of his visit. The most distinctive visual feature of Khafre's pyramid is the cap of original casing stones that survives at the summit. This cap, a remnant of the smooth white Tura limestone casing that once covered the entire structure, gives the pyramid a distinctive appearance, as though the top had been dipped in snow. The survival of the casing at the top, while the lower courses have been stripped, is the result of the stripping process itself. The quarry workers who removed the casing in the medieval period worked from the bottom up, and the uppermost courses, being the most difficult to reach, were left in place. The cap serves as a reminder of what all the Giza pyramids once looked like, smooth, white, gleaming in the Egyptian sun, and it makes Khafre's pyramid, paradoxically, the most visually impressive of the three in many photographs, despite being slightly smaller than the Great Pyramid. The interior of Khafre's pyramid, while simpler than the Great Pyramid's elaborate system of chambers and passages, reveals its own engineering sophistication. The pyramid contains two entrance passages, one high on the north face, entering through the pyramid's masonry, and one at ground level, cut into the bedrock. Both lead to the same burial chamber, a rectangular room hewn from the living rock beneath the pyramid. The existence of two entrance passages has been interpreted as evidence of a plan change during construction. Perhaps the original design called for a higher burial chamber, which was later relocated to a lower position. The dual entrance system is unusual among Fourth Dynasty pyramids and remains one of the minor puzzles of the Giza complex. The workforce that built Khafre's complex drew on the same organizational systems that had served Khufu. The provisioning infrastructure, the work gang system, the administrative hierarchy, all were inherited from the previous reign. But Khafre's builders also faced unique challenges. The Giza Plateau was no longer empty. The Great Pyramid, with its surrounding mastaba cemeteries and temple complexes, occupied the most prominent position on the plateau. Khafre's architects had to work within the constraints of the existing landscape, positioning their structures to complement the Great Pyramid without competing with it. The result was a masterful exercise in architectural diplomacy. Khafre's pyramid is positioned on slightly higher ground, making it appear taller than the Great Pyramid from many angles, while its slightly smaller base ensures that it does not technically exceed its predecessor. Whether this was a deliberate illusion or a coincidence of topography is debated, but the visual effect, which has been fooling visitors for millennia, seems too perfect to be accidental. The Giza complex as a whole, the three pyramids, the Sphinx, the temples, the causeways, the subsidiary pyramids, and the hundreds of mastaba tombs, represents the single most concentrated landscape of monumental architecture in the ancient world. No other site in any civilization contains such a density of large-scale stone construction within such a compact area, and the architect of the second phase of this landscape, the phase that added the second pyramid, the Valley Temple, the Causeway, and possibly the Sphinx, was Khafre. The personal life of Khafre is almost entirely opaque. We know that he had multiple wives. At least two are attested in the archaeological record. Meresank III, whose beautifully decorated tomb in the Eastern Cemetery at Giza provides some of the finest examples of Old Kingdom painted relief, and Khamenebti I, who is mentioned in inscriptions from the period. We know that he had sons who held important administrative titles. Menkaure, his successor, was almost certainly his son, and several other princes are attested in the inscriptions of the Giza mastabas. But beyond these bare facts, the man is invisible. The contrast between the magnitude of Khafre's monuments and the poverty of his personal record is, in its way, more extreme than the same contrast in Khufu's case. Khufu at least has the ivory statuette, a tiny, inadequate portrait, but a portrait nonetheless. Khafre has the diorite statue, a magnificent, idealized, theologically charged image that tells us everything about how the king wanted to be seen and nothing about how he actually was. The diorite statue is not a portrait, it is a theological statement. The face it depicts is not a human face. It is a divine face, the face of the living Horus, calm, perfect, and impersonal. Looking at the diorite statue, we see the office, not the officer. We see the god, not the man. The family dynamics of the Fourth Dynasty royal house are themselves a subject of intense scholarly interest. The dynasty appears to have been riven by internal conflicts, the Gedefri episode being the most obvious example, and the pattern of succession suggests that the throne did not always pass smoothly from father to son. Khafre's own accession, following the enigmatic Gedefre, may have involved the displacement of a rival branch of the royal family. His decision to return to Giza, to build his pyramid adjacent to his father's, and to construct the Sphinx as a massive guardian of the necropolis. All of these choices can be read as political gestures designed to consolidate his authority and to erase, or at least overshadow, the legacy of his predecessor. And yet the face on the Sphinx, if it is Khafre's, has a different quality. It is weathered, damaged, incomplete. It has been exposed to the elements for 4,500 years. And in that exposure, it has acquired something that the diorite statue lacks: vulnerability. The Sphinx's face is the face of a man who has endured, who has been battered by time and sand and human neglect, and is still improbably present. If the diorite statue shows us Khafre as he wanted to be seen, divine, perfect, eternal, the Sphinx shows us Khafre as time has made him, damage, enduring, and unreachable. The Sphinx is the central mystery of Khafre's legacy, and one of the most debated monuments in the history of archaeology. It sits in a shallow depression at the eastern edge of the Giza Plateau, roughly 450 meters southeast of the Great Pyramid and directly in front of Khafre's Valley Temple. It faces due east toward the rising sun, and its body, the recumbent body of a lion, stretches roughly 73 meters from its paws to its haunches. The head, wearing the royal Nemes headdress and the remains of a urious cobra on the forehead, rises roughly 20 meters above the floor of the enclosure. The Sphinx was not built. It was carved, hewn directly from the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau, with additional blocks of limestone added to repair and extend certain features. The enclosure in which it sits was created by quarrying the surrounding rock, leaving the central mass of limestone in place and shaping it into the form of the recumbent lion. The quarried stone was not wasted. It was used to construct the Sphinx temple located directly in front of the monument, and possibly to supplement the construction of Khafre's Valley Temple, which stands adjacent to the Sphinx temple on its southern side. The relationship between the Sphinx and Khafre is the crux of the scholarly debate. The evidence for attributing the Sphinx to Khafre includes several compelling elements. First, the physical proximity. The Sphinx is positioned directly in front of Khafre's Valley Temple, and its enclosure appears to have been integrated into the overall design of Khafre's funerary complex. The causeway from Khafre's pyramid runs along the south side of the Sphinx enclosure, and the alignment of the various structures suggests a unified architectural plan. Second, the geological evidence. The stone quarried from the Sphinx enclosure appears to have been used in the construction of the Sphinx temple, which in turn appears to have been built at the same time as Khafre's Valley Temple. The two temples share a similar architectural style and are built of the same type of limestone blocks. Third, the Dream Stela, a granite slab erected between the paws of the Sphinx by Pharaoh Thutmose IV, more than 1,000 years after Khafre's death. The Dream Stela which describes a dream in which the Sphinx promised Thutmose the throne in return for clearing the sand from its body, contains a partially damaged line of text that appears to include the syllable Khaf, which some scholars have read as a reference to Khafre, suggesting that the Sphinx was associated with Khafre in New Kingdom tradition. But here is the problem. None of this evidence is conclusive. The physical proximity of the Sphinx to Khafre's Valley Temple could indicate that Khafre built the Sphinx, or it could indicate that Khafre built his Valley Temple near a pre-existing Sphinx. The geological evidence links the Sphinx enclosure to the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple, but it does not definitively prove that all three were built during Khafre's reign. They could have been built sequentially over a longer period, and the dream stela, the closest thing to a contemporary textual attribution, is damaged precisely at the critical point. The syllable Khaf is a modern reconstruction based on a partially legible hieratic text, and not all scholars accept the reading. The alternative attribution, the idea that the Sphinx predates Khafre, has been advanced by several scholars, most notably the American geologist Robert Schoch. In 1990, Schoch conducted a geological survey of the Sphinx enclosure and argued that the pattern of weathering on the walls showed evidence of prolonged exposure to rainfall, a type of weathering that, he argued, was inconsistent with the relatively dry climate of the Giza Plateau during the mid-3rd millennium BC, but was consistent with the wetter climate of an earlier period, perhaps the 5th or 6th millennium BC. Schoch's conclusion that the Sphinx was carved thousands of years before Khafre, during a period when the Sahara region received significantly more rainfall, generated enormous controversy and was widely rejected by Egyptologists, who pointed out that the geological evidence could be explained by other factors, including the action of groundwater, salt crystallization, and the local microclimate of the Sphinx enclosure. The debate over the Sphinx's age has generated more heat than light. The mainstream position, that the Sphinx was carved during Khafre's reign, remains the most widely accepted interpretation among professional Egyptologists. But the evidence is not as airtight as popular accounts sometimes suggest. The attribution depends on circumstantial evidence, proximity, architectural style, and a damaged inscription, rather than on the kind of unambiguous textual or archaeological proof that would settle the question beyond dispute. And it gets stranger, because the Sphinx itself presents physical puzzles that no theory has fully explained. The head of the Sphinx is disproportionately small relative to the body, a fact that has led some scholars to suggest that the head was recarved from an earlier, larger head at some point in its history. The original head, according to this hypothesis, may have depicted a lion or a different pharaoh, and was reduced in size when it was recarved into the likeness of Khafre, or whoever the current face represents. The hypothesis is speculative, but it accounts for the undeniable disproportion between the head and the body. A disproportion that is unusual in Egyptian art, where the relationship between the parts of a figure was governed by strict canons of proportion. The face of the Sphinx has been the subject of forensic analysis, with conflicting results. In 1993, the New York police detective Frank Domingo, who was trained in forensic facial identification, compared the face of the Sphinx with the face of the Khafre diorite statue and concluded that they were not the same person. Domingo argued that the Sphinx's face had a broader jaw, a more prominent brow, and a different overall proportion than Khafre's statue. Other scholars have challenged Domingo's methodology and conclusions, arguing that the comparison is unreliable because the Sphinx's face has been severely damaged by weathering and vandalism and cannot be accurately compared with a well-preserved statue. The debate remains unresolved. The missing nose of the Sphinx has generated its own mythology. The popular legend that Napoleon's soldiers shot off the nose during their Egyptian campaign in 1798 is demonstrably false. Sketches of the Sphinx made before Napoleon's arrival show the nose already missing. The most likely explanation, supported by the evidence of chisel marks on the face, is that the nose was deliberately removed, possibly by a medieval religious figure who objected to the Sphinx as an object of idolatry. The Arab historian al-Makrizi writing in the 15th century, attributed the vandalism to a Sufi mystic named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar, who destroyed the nose in 1378 as an act of religious protest. Whether this account is accurate is uncertain, but the chisel marks on the face are consistent with deliberate removal rather than natural erosion. The Sphinx Temple, a ruined structure located directly in front of the Sphinx, between its outstretched paws and the edge of the enclosure, provides additional evidence for the dating and function of the Sphinx. The temple is built of massive limestone blocks quarried from the Sphinx enclosure, faced with red granite from Aswan. Its interior originally contained 2 rows of massive square pillars, creating a columned hall similar to the interior of Khafre's Valley Temple. The temple appears to have been designed for solar rituals. Its axis is oriented toward the east, and it may have been used for ceremonies related to the rising and setting of the sun. This solar orientation is consistent with the Sphinx's eastward gaze and suggests a connection between the Sphinx and the solar theology that was becoming increasingly important during the Fourth Dynasty. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. For all the scholarly attention lavished on the Sphinx, for all the theories proposed and debated, for all the geological surveys and forensic analyses and archaeological excavations, we still do not know with certainty who built it. We still do not know what it was called by the people who carved it. The name Sphinx is Greek, not Egyptian. The ancient Egyptian name for the monument is uncertain. It may have been called Horemheket, meaning Horus of the Horizon, but this name is attested only from the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after the monument was carved. The original name, if it had one, is lost. We have a face, we do not have a name. We have a monument, we do not have an explanation. The Sphinx is the most famous mystery in archaeology, and it is a mystery that may never be fully solved, because the evidence that would solve it, a foundation inscription, a contemporary text, an unambiguous archaeological context, has not been found and may not exist. The Sphinx stares east. It has been staring east for more than 4,500 years, and it keeps its secrets. The physical history of the Sphinx, its construction, its deterioration, its repeated burial and excavation, is itself a remarkable story that illuminates both the monument's endurance and its vulnerability. The Sphinx was carved from a geological formation known as the Mokattam Formation, a series of limestone layers of varying hardness that underlie the Giza Plateau. The head and upper body are carved from a relatively hard layer of limestone. The lower body and the enclosure walls are carved from softer layers that are more susceptible to weathering, more porous, and more easily eroded by wind, sand, and moisture. This geological variation accounts for the uneven deterioration of the monument. The head, carved from harder stone, has retained its shape relatively well, while the body, carved from softer stone, has been severely eroded. The erosion of the Sphinx's body has been ongoing for millennia. The horizontal layers of soft limestone have weathered into deep channels, creating a corrugated surface that gives the body a rough, pitted appearance quite different from the smooth, precise forms typical of Egyptian sculpture. The cause of this erosion, wind, sand, water, or some combination, has been debated since the early 19th century. The conventional explanation attributes the erosion primarily to wind-driven sand, which would have abraded the exposed surfaces whenever the Sphinx was not buried in sand. The alternative explanation, advanced by Robert Schoch and supported by some geologists, attributes the erosion to water, either rainfall or groundwater, and argues that the pattern of weathering is inconsistent with wind erosion alone. The debate over the Sphinx's weathering patterns has become entangled with the broader question of the Sphinx's age. If the erosion was caused primarily by rainfall, then the monument must date to a period when the Giza region received significantly more rain than it does today, a condition that last obtained several thousand years before the conventional date of Khafre's reign. If the erosion was caused primarily by wind and sand, then the conventional date is consistent with the observed weathering. The geological evidence has been interpreted differently by different experts, and the debate has not been resolved. What is not debated is that the Sphinx has been buried in sand for most of its existence. The desert sand, driven by the prevailing northwest winds, accumulates in the Sphinx's enclosure at a rate of roughly 1 meter per decade. Without regular clearing, the Sphinx would be buried to its shoulders within a century. This has happened repeatedly throughout the monument's history. The Dream Stela of Thutmose IV, erected between the Sphinx's paws around 1400 BC, describes the Sphinx as buried to its neck in sand at the time of Thutmose's encounter with it, more than 1,000 years after it was carved. The stela records that Thutmose cleared the sand as an act of piety and was rewarded with the throne, a story that may be historical or may be political mythology designed to legitimize Thutmose's succession. Later clearings documented in the historical record. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius is reported to have ordered a clearing of the Sphinx during the 2nd century AD. Another partial clearing was carried out during the Islamic period, and the modern era has seen multiple attempts to fully excavate and conserve the monument, beginning with Giovanni Battista Caviglia's excavation in 1817, continuing with Auguste Mariette's work in the 1850s, and culminating in the comprehensive clearings carried out by the Egyptian Antiquities Service in the 1920s and 30s under the direction of Émile Barrès. Barrès's excavation, which took more than 10 years, revealed the full extent of the Sphinx's body for the first time in the modern era, and exposed the Sphinx temple, the enclosure walls, and the complex network of repairs and additions that had accumulated over the monument's long history. The repairs are extensive. Large areas of the Sphinx's body have been patched with limestone blocks, some dating to the New Kingdom, some to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, and some to the modern era. The most recent major conservation effort, carried out in the 1980s and 90s, involved the application of new limestone blocks to the deteriorating body and the installation of drainage systems to control the groundwater that threatens the monument's foundation. The conservation of the Sphinx is an ongoing challenge, a battle against the same forces of erosion, subsidence, and moisture that have been attacking the monument since the day it was carved. The limestone of the Sphinx's body is porous and friable. It absorbs moisture from the ground and from the air. Salt crystals form within the pores and expand, causing the surface to flake and crumble. The weight of the massive head, carved from denser, more durable stone, places stress on the softer stone of the neck, creating a risk of structural failure that has concerned engineers for decades. The Sphinx is not just an archaeological monument. It is an engineering problem, a structure that requires constant monitoring, maintenance, and intervention to survive. This vulnerability is itself a contrast with the pyramids, which require almost no maintenance to endure. The pyramids are stable, self-supporting structures whose massive weight and geometric form make them essentially immune to the forces that threaten the Sphinx. The Sphinx, by contrast, is a sculpture, a work of art carved from the natural rock, exposed to the elements, subject to erosion, subsidence, and structural failure. The pyramids will almost certainly outlast the Sphinx by millennia. The oldest known monumental sculpture in Egypt may, ironically, be among the first of the Giza monuments to disappear. This fact lends an urgency to the study of the Sphinx that the study of the pyramids does not possess. The pyramids can wait, the Sphinx cannot. Every year that passes, the monument deteriorates a little further. Every rainstorm, every sandstorm, every fluctuation in the water table takes its toll. The face that has stared east for more than 4,500 years is slowly being erased by the same natural forces that created the landscape from which it was carved. The desert gave the Sphinx its material. The desert is taking it back, and the question of whose face is disappearing, the question of whether it is Khafre's face, or Khufu's face, or the face of some unknown pharaoh or deity, becomes more urgent with every passing decade, because if the face is lost before the question is answered, then the question itself becomes unanswerable. The evidence that might resolve the debate, the subtle contours of the face, the proportions of the features, the traces of paint or carving that might identify the subject, is being eroded away. The clock is ticking, and the Sphinx, as always, says nothing. The emotional weight of the Sphinx is unlike that of any other ancient monument. The pyramids inspire awe, the temples inspire reverence, but the Sphinx inspires something closer to unease. The discomfort of being watched by something very old, very large, and very silent. The face is human, the body is animal. The combination is deliberate, a fusion of human intelligence and animal power that was intended, in the theology of ancient Egypt, to represent the king's divine authority over both the human and the natural world. But the effect, 4,500 years later, is less theological than visceral. The Sphinx is uncanny. It sits at the boundary between the human and the inhuman, the natural and the artificial, the known and the unknown. And its silence, its absolute, impenetrable, 4,500-year silence, is the most unsettling thing about it. We have asked the Sphinx who built it. We have asked it for 2 centuries, and it has not answered. The scholarly debate over the Sphinx is not merely academic. It touches on fundamental questions about the nature of archaeological evidence and the limits of what we can know about the ancient past. The attribution of the Sphinx to Khafre rests on circumstantial evidence, proximity, architectural context, a damaged inscription. This evidence is substantial, and it is accepted by the majority of Egyptologists as sufficient to support the attribution. But it is not proof, and the difference between evidence and proof is the space in which the mystery lives. The Egyptologist Mark Lehner, who has spent more than 20 years studying the Sphinx, has described the monument as the most thoroughly investigated sculpture in the world, and yet one whose fundamental questions remain open. Lehner's own work has provided some of the strongest evidence for the Khafre attribution. His detailed mapping of the Sphinx and its enclosure has demonstrated that the quarried stone from the enclosure was used in the construction of the Sphinx temple and, by extension, was contemporary with the construction of Khafre's Valley Temple. His analysis of the geological layers exposed in the Sphinx's body has provided a more detailed understanding of the monument's construction sequence, and his reconstruction of the original appearance of the Sphinx, based on traces of plaster, paint, and carved detail, has produced an image of the monument that is very different from the weathered, noseless ruin that visitors see today. A brightly painted figure, its face painted red, its Nemes headdress striped in blue and gold, its body perhaps draped in a ceremonial garment. The Sphinx that the ancient Egyptians knew was not the austere, monochromatic figure that we see. It was a polychrome sculpture of vivid colour and startling detail. Lehner has written that studying the Sphinx is like studying a patient with a long and complex medical history. A patient whose body bears the traces of every illness, every treatment, every injury sustained over a lifetime of more than 4,500 years. The repairs, the patches, the additions, the removals, all of these are visible in the stone, layered one on top of another, creating a palimpsest of interventions that is extraordinarily difficult to untangle, separating the original construction from the later modifications, determining which features date to the Fourth Dynasty and which were added or altered during subsequent periods, is one of the central challenges of Sphinx research. The most recent phase of scholarly investigation has introduced new technologies to the study of the Sphinx. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic surveys, and photogrammetric mapping have been used to investigate the monument's internal structure and its relationship to the surrounding bedrock. These studies have revealed several previously unknown features, including cavities and passages within the body of the Sphinx that may be natural geological features or may be man-made. The interpretation of these features is ongoing, and no definitive conclusions have been reached. The Sphinx, like the Great Pyramid, continues to surprise, revealing new features and new puzzles with each new investigation. The cultural legacy of the Sphinx extends far beyond Egyptology. The figure of the Sphinx, a creature with a human head and an animal body, appears in the mythologies of multiple ancient civilizations. The Greek Sphinx, which appears in the myth of Oedipus, is a female creature that poses riddles and devours those who cannot answer. The Egyptian Sphinx, by contrast, is typically male and is associated with royal power and solar divinity. Whether the Greek Sphinx was directly inspired by the Egyptian prototype, or whether the two figures developed independently from a common cultural ancestor, is debated. But the Egyptian Sphinx at Giza is certainly the oldest and most famous example of the type, and its influence on subsequent representations of Sphinx figures in Greek, Roman, and later European art is well documented. The The Sphinx has also been a magnet for esoteric and pseudoscientific speculation. Claims that the Sphinx contains hidden chambers, conceals ancient libraries, or serves as a portal to an underground city have been circulating since the 19th century and show no sign of abating. These claims are, without exception, unsupported by evidence. The scientific investigations of the Sphinx's interior, using ground-penetrating radar, seismic refraction, and other geophysical techniques, have found no evidence of large hidden chambers or artificial passages within the body of the monument. The Sphinx is, as far as the evidence shows, exactly what it appears to be: a massive limestone sculpture carved from the bedrock of the Giza Plateau, sitting in an open-air enclosure facing east. But the persistence of the speculation tells us something about the power of the monument itself. The Sphinx is so old, so large, so enigmatic, and so visually compelling that it triggers a deep human desire for explanation, for a story that accounts for its existence, its purpose, and its meaning. The scholarly explanation that it was carved during the Fourth Dynasty as a guardian figure associated with the royal funerary complex is accurate as far as the evidence allows, but is not emotionally satisfying to those who feel that the Sphinx should mean something more. The gap between the scholarly answer and the emotional expectation is the space in which the myths, the conspiracies, and the pseudoscience flourish. The truth is more powerful than the myths, but it is also more modest. The Sphinx was carved by human beings using copper tools and stone pounders from a natural limestone formation on the Giza Plateau. It was probably carved during the reign of Khafre as part of his funerary complex, and it was probably intended to serve as a guardian figure, a monumental embodiment of royal power, positioned at the entrance to the necropolis, watching over the approach to the pyramids. Its face is probably Khafre's face, though the identification is not certain. Its purpose was probably religious and political, a fusion of divine and royal authority expressed in the most permanent medium available. The word probably appears 4 times in that paragraph. That is the honest state of our knowledge. After 2 centuries of investigation, the Sphinx remains a monument about which we can say, probably, but certainly with difficulty. And that uncertainty, that persistent, irreducible gap between what we know and what we wish we knew, is what makes the Sphinx the most fascinating monument in the ancient world. The Sphinx has survived everything that 4,500 years could throw at it: sand burial, nose removal, water damage, salt crystallization, earthquakes, tourist traffic, and the slow, patient erosion of wind and time. It has been patched with stone from the New Kingdom, the Ptolemaic period, the Roman period, and the modern era. Its body is a geological timeline of repair, each layer telling the story of a generation that recognized the monument's significance and invested effort in its preservation. The Sphinx has survived because people kept choosing to save it, clearing the sand, patching the stone, shoring up the crumbling body. Its survival is not passive. It is active, the result of 4,500 years of human attention, intermittent but never permanently withdrawn. And yet the face continues to erode. The features that might identify the subject, the contours of the cheeks, the shape of the jaw, the proportions of the brow, grow less distinct with every passing century. The face that was carved with such precision 4.5 millennia ago is slowly becoming a generalized form, human, but no longer specific. The Sphinx is losing its identity, even as scholars argue about what that identity is. And the irony is painful. The most debated face in the ancient world is the face that is most rapidly disappearing. The history of the Sphinx, after the Old Kingdom, is itself a testament to the monument's enduring power. During the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after the Sphinx was carved, the monument experienced a revival of interest and veneration. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, particularly Amenhotep II and Thutmose IV, treated the Sphinx as a manifestation of the sun god, erecting stelae and building temples in its vicinity. The dream stela of Thutmose IV, placed between the Sphinx's paws, records the most famous of these encounters. A young prince, resting in the shadow of the buried monument during a hunting expedition, receives a message from the Sphinx, now identified with the god Horemheb, Horus of the horizon, promising him the throne in exchange for clearing the sand. Whether Thutmose actually had this dream, or whether the stela was a political fiction designed to legitimize his succession, is debatable. But the story reveals something important about how the Egyptians of the New Kingdom perceived the Sphinx. They saw it as a living divine presence, not merely as a monument. The Sphinx was not a relic of the past. It was an active participant in the affairs of the living, a god who could intervene in human events, who could grant favors and make demands, who required attention and care. This perception of the Sphinx as a living entity, rather than a dead monument, may explain why so many pharaohs over so many centuries invested effort in clearing the sand from its body and maintaining its structure. They were not restoring an artifact. They were serving a god. The transition from monument to deity, from a royal portrait to a divine presence, is one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of religion. The Sphinx was, in all probability, originally a portrait of a specific king, a representation of Khafre, or possibly Khufu, in the form of the royal lion. But over the course of a millennium, the specific identity of the subject was forgotten, and the monument was reimagined as a manifestation of the sun god, a cosmic figure whose significance transcended the identity of any individual king. The Sphinx became more than its creator. It outlived not just the man, but the meaning. This transformation from portrait to deity raises a profound question about the relationship between monuments and memory. Khafre built the Sphinx, if he built it, to preserve his own image for eternity. But the monument outlived its creator's identity. Within 1,000 years, no one remembered whose face the Sphinx wore. The name Khafre was no longer associated with the monument. The colossal face that may have been carved in his likeness had become anonymous. A divine presence without a human origin, the monument succeeded in enduring. It failed in preserving the identity of its builder. This is the same paradox we have encountered with every pyramid builder we have studied. The paradox that the building survives while the builder is forgotten. But the Sphinx takes the paradox one step further. The pyramids are geometric forms, abstract shapes that do not depict any specific person. The Sphinx is as a portrait, a representation of a human face, carved on a colossal scale, designed to be recognized. And yet the face was not recognized. It was reinterpreted, reimagined, and eventually dissociated from the person it depicted. The most ambitious portrait in human history, a face carved from a ridge of living limestone, 73 meters long and 20 meters high, failed to identify its subject. If a face carved on that scale cannot preserve a person's identity, then what can? The answer, it seems, is nothing. Not stone, not scale, not the most durable material worked by the most skilled hands into the most recognizable form. All monuments, given enough time, lose their connection to their creators. All faces, given enough weathering, become anonymous. All names, given enough silence, are forgotten, unless someone speaks them again. The Sphinx of Giza is the oldest and most famous member of a family of colossal Gardian figures that appears across multiple ancient civilizations. To understand the Sphinx's significance, we need to see it in the context of these other Guardian figures, and to understand why the impulse to carve enormous watchful faces into the landscape is not unique to Egypt, but is a recurring feature of human monumental culture. The first and most immediate context is Egypt itself. The Sphinx at Giza was not the only Sphinx figure in ancient Egyptian art. The Sphinx, a creature with a lion's body and a human or animal head, was a standard motif in Egyptian sculpture, appearing in contexts ranging from small amulets to monumental temple guardians. The Avenue of Sphinxes at Karnak, a processional road lined with hundreds of ram-headed Sphinx figures connecting the temples of Karnak and Luxor, is one of the most impressive examples. These sphinxes, each roughly 3 meters long and carved from sandstone, were not portraits of individual kings. They were generic figures, embodiments of royal power and divine protection, positioned to guard the sacred space of the temple complex. The Giza Sphinx is unique among these figures in several respects. It is the oldest, it is the largest, it was carved from the living rock rather than from quarried blocks, and its face appears to represent a specific individual rather than a generic royal type. These qualities set the Giza Sphinx apart from every other Sphinx figure in Egypt and make it a monument of singular importance, not just as a work of sculpture, but but as a statement about the relationship between the individual king and the cosmic forces he was believed to embody. The guardian figure tradition extends far beyond Egypt. The Lamassu of ancient Assyria, colossal winged bulls with human heads, positioned at the gateways of palaces and citadels, served a similar function to the Egyptian Sphinx. They guarded the entrance to sacred or royal space, projecting an image of divine power that was intended to awe visitors and deter enemies. The largest Lamassu figures, carved from single blocks of gypsum weighing up to 30 tons, stood roughly 5 meters high and were positioned in pairs at the entrances to the palaces of kings like Sargon II at Khorsabad and Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The similarities between the Lamassu and the Sphinx are striking. Both combine a human head with an animal body. Both are positioned at entrances. Both are carved on a monumental scale. Both are intended to project an image of power and divine authority. But the differences are equally significant. The Lamassu are architectural elements. They are integrated into the structure of the palace gate, serving as both supports and decorations. The Sphinx is a freestanding sculpture, carved from the natural bedrock, independent of any building, occupying its own space in the landscape. The Lamassu were carved from quarried blocks and could, in principle, be moved. The Sphinx is carved from the living rock and is permanently fixed to its location. The Sphinx is not just a guardian figure. It is a geological feature, a part of the landscape itself, shaped by human hands but rooted in the earth. The colossal Buddhas of Bamiyan, in what is now Afghanistan, offer another comparison. These two massive figures, one roughly 55 meters tall, the other roughly 38 meters tall, were carved from the sandstone cliffs of the Bamiyan Valley during the 6th and 7th centuries AD. They stood for more than 1,500 years, watching over the valley like sentries, until they were destroyed by the Taliban in 2001, using dynamite and artillery. The destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas was a deliberate act of cultural erasure, a statement that the monuments and the traditions they represented had no place in the world as the destroyers envisioned it. The destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas cast a long shadow over the conservation of the Sphinx. The Sphinx, like the Buddhas, is a colossal figure carved from the living rock. It is, like the Buddhas, vulnerable to deliberate damage, and it has, like the Buddhas, already been the target of deliberate mutilation. The removal of the nose, probably in the 14th century, was an act of iconoclasm motivated by religious objections to the monument. The Sphinx has survived this mutilation. The Buddhas did not survive theirs. The difference is a matter of degree, not of kind. The colossal statues of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel, 4 seated figures, each roughly 20 meters high, carved from the sandstone cliff face of the Nile Valley in Lower Nubia, offer yet another comparison. The Abu Simbel statues, carved more than 1,200 years after the Sphinx, share many of its qualities. They are carved from the living rock, they serve as guardians of a sacred space, and they depict a specific individual. But the Abu Simbel figures are explicitly identified. Ramesses' name and titles are carved in hieroglyphics on the facade, leaving no doubt about the identity of the subject. The Sphinx, by contrast, bears no such identification. Its anonymity is its most distinctive feature and its most frustrating one. The practice of carving colossal figures from the living rock appears in other cultures as well. The rock-cut churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia, carved from volcanic tuff in the 12th and 13th centuries AD, represent a different application of the same basic technique, the transformation of natural stone into architectural form through subtraction rather than addition. The Moai of Easter Island, the famous stoneheads, carved from volcanic tuff and erected on stone platforms around the island's coastline, are another example of colossal sculptural ambition, though they are carved from quarried blocks rather than from the living rock. Each of these traditions demonstrates the same fundamental impulse: the human desire to shape the natural landscape into something meaningful, to impose human form on natural material, to create something that is simultaneously geological and cultural. The Sphinx stands at the head of this global tradition, the oldest, largest, and most enigmatic example of the human impulse to carve monumental figures from the earth itself. Its influence on subsequent cultures is difficult to trace directly. The Assyrian Lamassu, the Bamiyan Buddhas, and the Moai were almost certainly independent inventions, rather than imitations of the Egyptian Sphinx. But the impulse behind them is the same: the desire to create a permanent guardian, a watchful presence, a face that gazes out over the landscape and says, "This place is protected. This place is important. This place belongs to someone who has the power to carve mountains." Khafre, if the Sphinx is his, was the first person in human history to leave his face carved on this scale. The ambition is staggering: not merely to build a tomb, which other pharaohs had done, not merely to build a temple, which other civilizations had done, but to carve a portrait of himself, his own face, wearing his own royal regalia, from a ridge of natural limestone, on a scale so vast that the result would be visible from kilometers away and would endure for millennia. The Sphinx is not just a monument. It is a declaration of identity on a geological scale, a human face imposed on the earth itself, permanent as the rock from which it was carved, patient as the desert that surrounds it. The decline of the Fourth Dynasty, after Khafre and Menkaure, followed the same pattern we have observed in every study of the pyramid-building tradition. Menkaure's pyramid, the smallest of the three Giza pyramids, with a base of roughly 108 meters on each side and an original height of roughly 65 meters, represents a clear step down in scale from Khafre's monument. The reasons for this reduction are debated. Some scholars attribute it to diminishing resources, others to changing theological priorities, and still others to a conscious decision by Menkaure to invest more in the quality of his temple complex than in the size of his pyramid. The lower 16 courses of Menkaure's pyramid were cased in red granite from Aswan, a labor-intensive choice that suggests ambition even as the overall scale contracted. Menkaure himself is better attested in the artistic record than Khafre. The Harvard-Boston expedition, led by George Andrew Reisner in the early 20th century, discovered a series of extraordinary statues in Menkaure's Valley Temple, including several triad groups showing the king flanked by the goddess Hathor and a personification of an Egyptian province. These statues, carved from grey-wacke and schist, are among the finest works of Old Kingdom sculpture. Their surfaces polished to a luminous sheen, their proportions elegant and precise. The quality of the sculpture suggests that the artistic traditions of the Fourth Dynasty were still vigorous, even as the architectural ambitions were contracting. The Fifth Dynasty marked a decisive shift in Egyptian royal theology and building practice. The pharaohs of the Fifth Dynasty, Usakaf, Sahure, Neferikare, Nusere, and their successors, built their pyramids at Abusir and Saqqara rather than at Giza. The pyramids were smaller and less precisely built than their Fourth Dynasty predecessors. But the Fifth Dynasty introduced a new architectural form, the Sun Temple, an open-air sanctuary dedicated to the sun god Ra, with a massive obelisk-shaped monument at its center. The investment in sun temples, at least 6 were built during the Fifth Dynasty, represents a theological shift away from the pyramid as the sole expression of royal piety and toward a more diversified architectural program. The Sixth Dynasty continued the decline of the pyramid tradition while introducing a new element, the pyramid texts. These religious inscriptions, carved on the walls of the burial chambers of the Sixth Dynasty pyramids, are the oldest known corpus of religious literature in the world. They include spells, prayers, and ritual instructions designed to guide the dead king through the underworld and ensure his resurrection among the stars. The appearance of the pyramid texts represents a fundamental shift in the technology of royal afterlife, where the Fourth Dynasty pharaohs had relied on architecture alone, on the physical form of the pyramid, the placement of the sarcophagus, the alignment of the passages. The Sixth Dynasty pharaohs supplemented architecture with language. The written word, carved in stone, became an additional tool in the quest for immortality. The collapse of the Old Kingdom, around 2100 BC, brought the pyramid-building tradition to an end. The causes of the collapse were multiple and interconnected. A series of low Nile floods reduced agricultural productivity, provincial governors accumulated power at the expense of the central government, and the royal court lost the authority and resources needed to sustain monumental construction. The First Intermediate Period, roughly 140 years of political fragmentation and economic decline, saw the complete cessation of royal pyramid building. When the Middle Kingdom pharaohs reunified Egypt around 2040 BC, they revived the pyramid form but on a reduced scale and with inferior materials. The Giza monument stood through all of this. The three pyramids, the Sphinx, the temples and causeways, massive, immovable, and increasingly mysterious. As the centuries passed and the knowledge of the Old Kingdom faded, the monuments became objects of wonder rather than understanding. The New Kingdom pharaohs who visited Giza treated the pyramids as relics of a distant past. Monuments whose builders were known by name, but whose construction methods were already beyond recovery. By the time the Greeks arrived, in the 7th century BC, the pyramids were among the oldest buildings on Earth, and the Sphinx was already buried to its shoulders in sand. The recovery of the Giza complex's history, the painstaking reconstruction of who built what, when, and why, is the achievement of modern archaeology. It began with Napoleon's expedition in 1798, continued through the great excavations of the 19th and 20th centuries, and continues today with the application of new technologies, muon tomography, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, photogrammetry, that are revealing new details about the monuments and their context. But the fundamental questions remain. The Sphinx's builder is uncertain. The Great Pyramid's construction method is debated. The internal plans of all three pyramids may contain undiscovered spaces. The Giza complex, after 2 centuries of systematic investigation, still holds secrets. The comparison between the Giza monuments and the great monuments of other civilizations puts Khafre's achievement in global perspective. The terracotta army of Qin Shi Huang, buried near Xi'an in China around 210 BC, is one of the most remarkable examples of monumental sculpture in the ancient world. More than 8,000 life-size clay soldiers, each individually modelled, arranged in military formation in subterranean pits. But the terracotta army, for all its grandeur, is fundamentally different from the Sphinx. The soldiers are manufactured objects, mass-produced from moulds, assembled from components, fired in kilns. The Sphinx is a natural object transformed, a ridge of living rock shaped by human hands into a form that is simultaneously geological and cultural. The terracotta army was hidden underground, designed never to be seen by human eyes. The Sphinx was placed in the open air, designed to be seen by everyone who approached the Giza complex. The Colossus of Rhodes, a bronze statue of the sun god Helios, roughly 33 meters tall, erected at the entrance to the harbour of Rhodes around 280 BC, is often cited as an ancient predecessor of modern colossal statues. But the Colossus stood for only 56 years before being destroyed by an earthquake, and its remains were eventually sold for scrap. The Sphinx has survived for more than 4,500 years. The difference between 56 years and 4,500 years is the difference between a monument and a geological feature. The Colossus was a building. The Sphinx is a part of the earth. This comparison underscores the unique quality of the Sphinx among the monuments of the ancient world. It is not the largest sculpture. It is not the most technically accomplished. It is not the best preserved. But it is the most deeply rooted, the most permanently and irrevocably attached to the landscape from which it was carved. The Sphinx cannot be moved, it cannot be dismantled, it cannot be melted down for scrap or quarried for building material. It can only be eroded, slowly, grain by grain, over millennia, back into the bedrock from which it came. The Sphinx is not sitting on the earth. The Sphinx is the earth, a part of the planet's crust, shaped into human form by human hands, enduring as only the earth can endure. The question of the Sphinx's meaning, in the context of Fourth Dynasty theology, connects to the broader question of how Khafre understood his own role in the cosmic order. The Egyptian king was not merely a political ruler. He was the nexus point between the human and the divine, the figure through whom the power of the gods flowed into the world of the living. The Sphinx, with its fusion of human head and lion body, may have been intended to embody this nexus. The human face represented the king's intelligence, his authority, his identity as a specific individual. The lion body represented his power, the raw, physical, untamable force of the most dangerous predator in the African landscape. Together, the two elements created a figure that was simultaneously human and superhuman, a being that combined the best of both worlds, the mind of a king and the body of a beast. This interpretation is consistent with the broader pattern of human-animal hybrid figures in Egyptian art. The gods themselves were frequently depicted with animal heads. Horus with a falcon's head, Anubis with a jackal's head, Thoth with an ibis head. The fusion of human and animal was not a monstrous or frightening concept in Egyptian theology. It was a natural expression of divine power, a visual language that communicated, immediately and intuitively, the idea that the figure depicted was more than human. The Sphinx, in this context, was not a strange or alien creation. It was a perfectly legible theological statement. This is the king, and the king is divine. The lion, specifically, was associated with solar power and royal authority in Egyptian culture. The lion was the guardian of the horizon, the point where the sun rose and set, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. By depicting the king as a lion, the Sphinx identified him with this boundary, with the moment of transition, the point of passage between life and death, light and darkness. The Sphinx's eastward gaze toward the rising sun reinforced this association. The king as lion watched over the sunrise, guarding the moment when light returned to the world after the darkness of night. Every sunrise was a triumph of the divine king over the forces of chaos, and the Sphinx, sitting at the boundary between the desert and the green valley, was the permanent witness to that daily triumph. This theological interpretation connects the Sphinx to the broader program of Khafre's funerary complex. The valley temple, the causeway, the mortuary temple, and the pyramid together formed a ritual landscape in which the dead king's journey from life to death to resurrection was enacted in architectural form. The Sphinx, positioned at the entrance to this landscape, was the first element encountered by anyone approaching from the valley. It was the guardian of the threshold, the figure that separated the world of the living from the world of the dead. Passing the Sphinx meant entering sacred space. It meant leaving the ordinary world behind and entering the realm of eternity. The experience of approaching Khafre's complex in antiquity would have been profoundly different from the experience of visiting Giza today. Today, visitors arrive by bus, surrounded by crowds, assaulted by the noise and commerce of modern tourism. In Khafre's time, the approach would have been controlled, ritualized, and deeply moving. The visitor, a priest, a family member, a pilgrim, would have traveled from the edge of the cultivation, through the valley temple, past the Sphinx, up the darkened causeway, and into the mortuary temple at the foot of the pyramid. The journey would have taken the visitor from the world of the living, green, wet, noisy, into the world of the dead, dry, silent, permanent. The architecture would have enacted the transition. The Sphinx would have been the first sign that the ordinary world had been left behind. This ritual function of the Sphinx, as a boundary marker between the living and the dead, may explain why it was positioned where it was. Not at the top of the plateau, near the pyramids, but at the bottom, near the edge of the cultivation. The Sphinx marks the point of entry. It is the first monument encountered, not the last. Its function is not to culminate the experience, but to initiate it, to signal, in the most dramatic way possible, that a threshold has been crossed. The question of whether Khafre intended all of this, whether his architects conceived of the complex as an integrated ritual landscape, with the Sphinx serving a specific function in a carefully choreographed sequence of architectural experiences, is impossible to answer with certainty. The ancient Egyptians did not leave architectural briefs or design documents. We can only infer their intentions from the physical evidence of the buildings themselves. But the evidence is suggestive. The alignment of the structures, the sequence of the spaces, the positioning of the Sphinx at the entrance to the complex. All of these point to a unified plan, executed with the same precision and intentionality that characterize every other aspect of Fourth Dynasty architecture. And if the plan was unified, if the Sphinx, the Valley Temple, the Causeway, the Mortuary Temple, and the Pyramid were all conceived as parts of a single architectural program, then Khafre's complex is the most complete expression of the funerary theology of the Old Kingdom. It is the building that shows us not just what the Egyptians built, but what they believed, how they understood the transition from life to death, how they imagined the relationship between the human and the divine, and how they used architecture to enact that relationship in physical, permanent, stone-built form. The afterlife of the Giza complex, the centuries and millennia during which the monuments were reinterpreted, repurposed, and reimagined by successive generations, is itself a story of extraordinary complexity. During the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after the Fourth Dynasty, the Giza Plateau was the site of a revival of interest in the monuments of the Old Kingdom. Pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasties erected stelae, built temples, and cleared sand from the Sphinx, treating the monument as a manifestation of the sun god Horemheb rather than as a portrait of a specific king. The original identity of the Sphinx, if it was Khafre's, had already been forgotten by this time. The monument had been transformed from a royal portrait into a divine presence. During the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, Giza became a tourist destination. Greek and Roman visitors inscribed their names and observations on the monuments. Graffiti that, while disrespectful by modern standards, provides useful evidence for the state of the monuments during these periods. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, described the Sphinx as a local deity worshipped by the inhabitants of the surrounding area. By the time the Arab conquest of Egypt occurred in the 7th century AD, the Sphinx had been partially buried in sand for centuries, and the pyramids had been stripped of much of their casing stone. The European rediscovery of the Giza complex during the 18th and 19th centuries brought new methods and new questions to the study of the monuments. Napoleon's scientific expedition of 1798 produced the first accurate measurements and drawings of the pyramids and the Sphinx. The subsequent work of Giovanni Belzoni, Auguste Mariette, Flinders Petrie, George Andrew Reisner, and Selim Hassan built up, layer by layer, the detailed understanding of the Giza complex that we possess today. But each generation of scholars has brought its own assumptions and its own blind spots, and the interpretation of the monuments has changed significantly over time. The most recent chapter in the investigation of Khafre's complex involves the application of technologies that would have been unimaginable to the early excavators. Satellite imagery has revealed previously unknown features of the Giza landscape, ancient channels, buried structures, and geological formations that provide new context for the monuments. Photogrammetric surveys have produced three-dimensional models of the Sphinx and the pyramids with millimeter precision, allowing scholars to study the monument's geometry and deterioration in unprecedented detail. Ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys have probed the subsurface of the plateau, revealing cavities, passages, and geological features that may be natural or may be man-made. And muon tomography, the same technique that revealed the big void inside the Great Pyramid, has the potential to reveal hidden spaces within Khafre's pyramid as well. These technologies are powerful, but they are not oracles. They produce data, not answers. The interpretation of the data requires the same combination of expertise, judgment, and intellectual honesty that has characterized the best archaeological work since Petrie. And the fundamental challenge remains. The evidence is circumstantial, the monument is silent, and the man behind it is invisible. The broader lesson of the Giza complex. The lesson that extends beyond Khafre, beyond the Fourth Dynasty, beyond ancient Egypt, is a lesson about the relationship between human ambition and human memory. The pharaohs of the Fourth Dynasty set out to build monuments that would last forever. They succeeded. The monuments have lasted, but the people who built them have not. The names survive: Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, preserved in inscriptions and king lists. But the persons behind the names, the individual human beings with their specific thoughts, fears, ambitions, and experiences, are lost. The monuments are impersonal. They tell us that powerful kings existed. They do not tell us what those kings were like. This is the central tragedy of monumental architecture. The building outlasts the builder. The monument survives. The person does not. And the more magnificent the monument, the more resources it consumes, the more labor it demands, the more stone it requires, the more completely it eclipses the person who commissioned it. The Great Pyramid has consumed Khufu. The Sphinx has consumed Khafre. The monuments have become the people, and the people behind the monuments have vanished. The Giza Plateau today is a landscape of stone and sand and tourists. The pyramids rise from the desert floor like geometric mountains. The Sphinx crouches in its enclosure, staring east. The valley temple of Khafre stands silent, its granite pillars casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. The causeways are buried, the mortuary temples are ruined, the casing stones are gone, and the kings who built it all, the most powerful rulers of the most powerful state in the ancient world, are invisible. Their bodies have been stolen. Their faces have been reduced to statues and figurines. Their names survive only in the inscriptions and king lists that modern scholars have painstakingly deciphered. But the stone endures, the pyramids endure, the Sphinx endures, and as long as these monuments stand, as long as there are people who visit them, study them, wonder about them, the names of the kings who built them will be spoken. Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure. These names, spoken tonight across a distance of 4,500 years, are the only immortality the pharaohs achieved. Not the immortality of the body, which was stolen. Not the immortality of the spirit, which is beyond the reach of archaeology, but the immortality of the name, the endurance of a word, a syllable, a sound, carried across millennia by the weight of the stone that bears it. There is one more dimension of the Khafre legacy that connects the ancient past to the modern present with unexpected force. The Sphinx, in its current state, is arguably the world's most famous conservation challenge. The monument is deteriorating. The soft limestone of its body absorbs moisture from the ground and from the air. Salt crystals form within the pores and expand, causing the surface to flake and crumble. The weight of the massive head, carved from denser limestone, places continuous stress on the softer stone of the neck. The foundation beneath the Sphinx is not level. The monument sits on a surface that slopes gently downward from head to tail, creating uneven loading that compounds the structural stress. And the urban development surrounding the Giza Plateau, the encroaching suburbs of Cairo, with their rising water tables and vibrating traffic, adds new threats that the ancient builders could not have anticipated. The conservation efforts undertaken since the 1980s have stabilized the Sphinx's condition, but have not reversed the damage. New limestone blocks have been applied to the deteriorating body, replicating the repairs undertaken by successive generations of ancient caretakers. Drainage systems have been installed to control the groundwater. Monitoring equipment tracks the monument's structural condition in real time. The Egyptian government has restricted development in the areas surrounding the plateau and has implemented visitor management programs to reduce the impact of tourism. But the fundamental challenge remains. The Sphinx is eroding, not quickly. The process is measured in millimeters per century rather than in catastrophic collapses, but the erosion is relentless. The face grows less distinct with every passing decade. The body grows rougher and more pitted. The details that might one day help identify the monument's builder, the subtle contours of the face, the traces of paint or plaster on the surface, are being slowly and irreversibly destroyed. The race between scholarship and erosion is the defining drama of Sphinx research. Scholars are working to extract every possible piece of information from the monument before the information is lost. Photographers are documenting the surface in unprecedented detail. Geologists are sampling and analyzing the limestone. Archaeologists are excavating the enclosure and the surrounding area in search of new evidence. But the clock is ticking, and the Sphinx, indifferent to human urgency, continues to weather at the same patient, implacable pace that it has maintained for 4,500 years. The question of whether the Sphinx will survive for another 4,500 years is one that modern engineers find difficult to answer with confidence. The monument is massive and inherently stable, but it is also fragile, carved from soft stone, exposed to the elements, subject to the cumulative effects of erosion, subsidence, and pollution. Without continued conservation, without the ongoing investment of human effort, human money, and human expertise, the Sphinx would deteriorate much more rapidly than it does today. Its survival is not guaranteed. It depends on the continued existence of institutions capable of maintaining it. Institutions that, as the history of the ancient world demonstrates, are not themselves permanent. The Sphinx has survived because people have kept choosing to save it. That chain of choice, Thutmose IV clearing the sand, the Ptolemaic and Roman restorers adding limestone patches, the modern conservators installing drainage systems, stretches back 4,500 years and must continue indefinitely if the monument is to endure. The Sphinx is not a passive survivor. It is an actively maintained survivor, a monument whose existence depends, and has always depended, on the willingness of successive generations to invest in its preservation. Khafre, if the Sphinx is his, was the first person in human history to leave his face carved on this scale. The ambition is staggering, not merely to build a tomb, which other pharaohs had done, not merely to build a temple, which other civilizations had done, but to carve a portrait of himself, his own face, wearing his own royal regalia, from a ridge of natural limestone, on a scale so vast that the result would be visible from kilometers away and would endure for millennia. The Sphinx is not just a monument, it is a declaration of identity on a geological scale. A human face imposed on the earth itself, permanent as the rock from which it was carved, patient as the desert that surrounds it. The decline of the Fourth Dynasty, after Khafre and Menkaure, followed the same pattern we have observed in every study of the pyramid-building tradition. The Fifth Dynasty pharaohs built smaller pyramids at Abusir and Saqqara, investing more heavily in sun temples and funerary texts than in monumental stone construction. The Sixth Dynasty continued the decline, and after the collapse of the Old Kingdom around 2100 BC, the Great Age of pyramid building was over, replaced by a century and a half of political fragmentation, economic collapse, and the slow erosion of the institutions that had made monumental construction possible. The Giza monuments, the three pyramids, the Sphinx, the temples and causeways stood through this collapse as they have stood through every subsequent crisis. They were too massive to be destroyed, too remote to be quarried easily, and too sacred to be deliberately dismantled. They survived the First Intermediate Period, the Middle Kingdom, the Hyksos invasion, the New Kingdom, the Persian conquest, the Greek conquest, the Roman conquest, the Arab conquest, and the modern era. They will almost certainly survive whatever comes next. But the knowledge of who built them, the specific, detailed understanding of which king built which monument, what the monuments meant, and how they functioned as parts of a unified funerary program, has been repeatedly lost and recovered over the course of these 4.5 millennia. The Sphinx was buried in sand for centuries at a time. The pyramids were stripped of their casing stones. The temples were dismantled. The causeways were buried. The inscriptions were eroded. And the names, Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, were forgotten by all but the most learned scholars. The monuments endured. The understanding did not. The recovery of that understanding, the painstaking reconstruction of the Giza complex's history, its architecture, its theology, and its meaning, is the achievement of modern archaeology. It is an achievement that began with the Description de l'Egypte, continued through the excavations of Mariette, Petrie, Reisner, and Selim Hassan, and reached its current state through the work of Lena, Hawass, and their colleagues. The Giza Plateau is, today, one of the most thoroughly documented archaeological sites on Earth, and yet the most basic question about its most famous monument, who carved the Sphinx, remains open. This is not a failure of archaeology. It is a measure of the difficulty of the question. The evidence is circumstantial. The monument bears no inscription. The archaeological context is suggestive but not conclusive. And the face itself, the crucial piece of evidence that might identify the subject, is too damaged by weathering to permit definitive forensic analysis. The question may never be answered with certainty. And the Sphinx, as it has done for 4,500 years, will continue to keep its silence. There is a moment, standing at the base of the Sphinx in the early morning light, when the monument's full weight becomes apparent, not its physical weight, though that is considerable, but its temporal weight. The Sphinx has been sitting in this exact spot, in this exact pose, wearing this exact expression, for more than 4,500 years. The dynasties that followed Khafre have come and gone. The empires that ruled Egypt have risen and fallen. The religions that dominated the Nile Valley have been born, flourished, and died. And the Sphinx has sat here through all of it, watching, waiting, silent. The deepest truth of the Sphinx is not about who built it. It is about what it means to be old. 4,500 years is not a number. It is an experience of endurance, so vast and so patient that it exceeds the capacity of human imagination to comprehend. We can say the words 4,500 years. We cannot feel them. We cannot grasp the weight of that much time, the sheer accumulated mass of days and nights and seasons and centuries that the Sphinx has endured. We can only stand before it and sense, dimly, that we are in the presence of something that has outlasted everything we know. Let that sink in. The Sphinx was already ancient when the Trojan War was fought. It was already more than 2,000 years old when Julius Caesar visited Egypt. It was already more than 3,000 years old when Muhammad was born. It has watched the entire recorded history of Western civilization unfold, from the invention of the alphabet to the invention of the internet, and it has not moved, not spoken, not changed its expression. It is the most patient artifact in human history. This patience is itself a form of power. The Sphinx does not demand attention. It does not announce itself. It does not compete with the pyramids for prominence. It simply sits, low, quiet, and watchful while the world changes around it. And in its patience, it teaches a lesson that the pyramids, for all their grandeur, do not teach. The pyramids teach that human beings can build on a monumental scale. The Sphinx teaches that human beings can endure on a monumental scale. The pyramids are about power. The Sphinx is about persistence. The pyramids are about what we can do. The Sphinx is about what we can survive. The face of the Sphinx, weathered, noseless, scarred by time, is the face of survival itself. It is the face of everything that has been battered by the elements and has refused to disappear. It is the face of every ancient monument, every ruined temple, every crumbling wall that still stands despite the forces that should have destroyed it long ago. The Sphinx is not a monument to a king. It is a monument to the stubborn refusal of stone to become sand, and the mystery of who built it. The question that has been asked for 2 centuries and may never be answered is, in the end, less important than the mystery of how it has survived. The attribution to Khafre is probable. It may be correct. But even if it is wrong, even if the Sphinx was carved by Khufu or by some unknown pharaoh of an earlier dynasty, the monument's meaning does not change. The face stares east. The body lies still. The limestone weathers, and the Sphinx endures. The grief at the heart of the Khafre story is the grief of the uncertain attribution, the grief of being probably, but not certainly, the creator of the most famous sculpture on earth. If the Sphinx is Khafre's, then his achievement is extraordinary. He left behind not just a pyramid but an icon, a face that has become the symbol of ancient Egypt itself. But the word if is always present. The attribution is never certain. And the shadow of that uncertainty falls across Khafre's legacy, like the shadow of the Sphinx itself, long, dark, and impossible to escape. This is not science fiction. This is the documented reality of how archaeological knowledge works. We deal in probabilities, not certainties. We say likely and probably, and the evidence suggests. We build our understanding on fragments, a damaged inscription, a statistical analysis of facial proportions, the relative positions of buildings on a plateau, and we acknowledge, honestly and without embarrassment, that the fragments may not be sufficient to support the conclusions we draw from them. The Sphinx may be Khafre's. The evidence suggests it is, but the evidence does not prove it, and in the gap between suggestion and proof, the mystery lives. The Sphinx's silence is the most eloquent statement in all of archaeology. It says, you can measure me, map me, analyze me, debate me. You can compare my face to statues, survey my geological layers, date my enclosure walls, but you cannot make me speak. I am stone, I endure, I watch, and I do not answer your questions. Let that sink in. The most studied sculpture in the world, the subject of more investigation, more analysis, more theorizing than any other single artifact, is also the most silent. The Sphinx has been interrogated by scholars for 2 centuries. It has been measured with laser scanners, probed with ground-penetrating radar, photographed from satellites, and analyzed by forensic experts, and it has answered none of their questions. It has yielded data, measurements, geological samples, photographic records, but it has not yielded meaning. The meaning remains locked in the stone, inaccessible to any instrument, resistant to any analysis, patient as the desert, and silent as the tomb. The modern world is uncomfortable with silence. We live in a culture of information, a culture that believes every question has an answer, Every mystery has a solution. Every puzzle can be decoded given sufficient data and sufficient ingenuity. The Sphinx defies this expectation. It presents a mystery that may be insoluble, not because the answer is hidden, but because the evidence that would reveal it has been destroyed by time. The face has eroded, the inscription has been damaged, the archaeological context has been compromised by millennia of quarrying, sand burial, and restoration. The evidence that might answer the question, a clear inscription identifying the builder, an undisturbed archaeological context linking the Sphinx unambiguously to Khafre's reign, may no longer exist, and the Sphinx, as always, does not care. It has been staring east for 4,500 years. It will continue to stare east for 4,500 more. It does not need our answers. It does not need our attention. It does not need us at all. We need it. We need the Sphinx. Not for what it can tell us about the past, but for what it tells us about the limits of our knowledge. The Sphinx is a reminder that the world is older than our understanding of it, that the past is deeper than our ability to reconstruct it, and that some questions will remain unanswered no matter how much ingenuity we bring to bear. The Sphinx teaches humility, and humility, in a world that often confuses knowledge with certainty, is a lesson worth learning. The Khafre story forces us to reconsider what we mean when we say we know the past. We know the shape of Khafre's pyramid. We know the dimensions of his valley temple. We know the composition of the diorite from which his statue was carved. We know the geological structure of the limestone from which the Sphinx was hewn. These are facts, measurable, verifiable, reproducible facts. But they are facts about objects, not about people. They tell us what was built, not who built it. They describe the monument, not the mind behind it. The mind behind the Giza complex, the intelligence that conceived of a pyramid, a temple, a causeway, and a colossal guardian figure as components of a single integrated architectural program, is as invisible to us as the face of the Sphinx is to a person standing behind it. We see the back of the monument. We do not see the face. We see the result of the planning. We do not see the planner. And the gap between the result and the person responsible for it is the gap that defines Khafre's legacy, a legacy of supreme architectural achievement and near-total personal obscurity. This gap is not unique to Khafre. It characterizes the study of the ancient world as a whole. We know the ancient world through its objects, its buildings, its sculptures, its inscriptions, its pottery. We do not know it through its people, the individuals who planned, designed, funded, and built the monuments of the ancient world are, with very few exceptions, invisible. We know their titles. We know their approximate dates. We know the monuments they left behind. But we do not know their thoughts, their motivations, their fears, their ambitions, their private moments of doubt or exhilaration. The ancient world is a world of objects without subjects, a world of things without the people who made them. The Sphinx is the supreme example of this condition. It is the most famous object in the ancient world, and the person who made it is unknown. The face that stares east may be Khafre's. It may not. We will probably never know for certain. And the monument, in its silence and its patience, does not care whether we know or not. It endures regardless. It stares east regardless. It weathers and erodes and is repaired and weathered again regardless. The human need for answers, for attribution, for identification, for the comfort of knowing who made what and why, is a human need. The Sphinx does not share it. There is a freedom in that indifference. The Sphinx is free from the burden of identity. It does not need to be Khafre's to be significant. It does not need a name to be powerful. It does not need an attribution to be meaningful. It is meaningful because it exists, because a colossal face has been staring east from the Giza Plateau for more than 4,500 years, and because that face, whoever carved it, is one of the most extraordinary things that human hands have ever made. The mystery is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be experienced. The Sphinx is not diminished by our uncertainty about its builder. It is enriched by it. The uncertainty adds a dimension of depth that a known and fully documented monument would lack. The Sphinx is the ancient world's greatest riddle, not because it poses a question that has no answer, but because it poses a question that has too many possible answers and not enough evidence to choose among them. And that condition, the condition of knowing something without being certain of it, of holding a probability without being able to convert it into proof, is the fundamental condition of all historical knowledge. Khafre left behind a pyramid, a temple complex, and possibly the most famous sculpture on Earth. He left behind a diorite statue of breathtaking beauty and a name carved in cartouches on the walls of his temples. He left behind a funerary complex that, in its completeness and its integration, surpasses anything else from the Old Kingdom, and yet he remains, after 4,500 years of investigation, a figure defined more by his monuments than by his biography, a pharaoh whose face may be carved on the Giza Plateau at a scale of 20 meters, but whose personality is invisible. The modern visitor to Giza, who pauses before the Sphinx, who ignores the tour guides and the souvenir vendors and the noise of traffic, and simply looks, will feel something that no photograph or documentary can convey. The feeling is not awe exactly. Though awe is part of it, it is not sadness, though sadness is there too. It is something closer to recognition, the recognition of a face that has been waiting, with infinite patience, for someone to look at it. The Sphinx does not speak, but it looks. It has been looking for 4,500 years, and the human response to that gaze, the instinctive, involuntary response to being watched by something very old and very still, is one of the most powerful experiences available in the archaeological world. That gaze, patient, unblinking, weathered but unbroken, is Khafre's gift to the future. Whether the face is his or not, the monument is part of his complex. It guards his approach. It watches over his eternity. And it carries, into every century and every millennium that follows, the presence of a pharaoh who wanted to be remembered, who carved a face into the living rock of the desert and left it there, facing east, waiting for the world to notice. The world has noticed. The face of the Sphinx is the most recognized image in archaeology. It appears on postage stamps, on book covers, on travel posters, on television screens, on the walls of classrooms around the world. It has become the symbol of ancient Egypt itself. The single image that, more than any pyramid or temple or inscription, represents the civilization of the pharaohs to the global imagination. And behind that image stands Khafre, probably, the man who probably built the face that represents the civilization. The pharaoh who probably left the most enduring mark of any individual on the landscape of the ancient world. The king who probably achieved what no other king, before or since, has achieved. The transformation of a natural hillside into a portrait that has survived for 4,500 years. Probably. That single word, that irreducible uncertainty, is the final mystery of Khafre's legacy. And it is, perhaps, the most appropriate memorial that any pharaoh could receive. A monument so old, so large, and so enigmatic that even after 4,500 years of scrutiny, we still cannot be certain whose face it wears. The contemplation of the Sphinx leads, inevitably, to a contemplation of time itself. The monument is not just old, it is old in a way that challenges the human capacity for temporal comprehension. We can understand centuries, we can dimly grasp millennia, but 4,500 years, the span of time that separates us from the carving of the Sphinx, exceeds the reach of intuitive understanding. We can only approach it through comparisons and analogies, each of which reveals the depth of the chasm between then and now. When the Sphinx was carved, the world was a place so different from the present that it might as well have been a different planet. There was no writing in Greece. There was no writing in China. The civilization of the Indus Valley was in its early stages. The megalithic builders of Neolithic Europe were still raising their stone circles. The Americas were populated by hunter-gatherers and early agricultural communities. The entire world, with the partial exception of Mesopotamia, was pre-literate. The Sphinx was carved in a world without alphabets, without iron, without wheels in most regions, without glass, without paper. It was carved in a world that we can barely imagine, and it has survived into a world that the people who carved it could not have imagined at all. The survival of the Sphinx across this incomprehensible span of time is the most powerful argument for the significance of what Khafre, or whoever built it, accomplished. The Sphinx is not just a sculpture, it is a bridge a physical connection between two worlds separated by 4,500 years of history. Standing before the Sphinx, we stand in the presence of something that was created by people who breathed the same air, walked the same ground, and looked up at the same stars. People who were, in every biological and psychological sense, identical to us, but who inhabited a world so different from ours that the word different barely begins to describe it. That connection, that thin, fragile, 4,500-year-long thread linking us to the people who carved the Sphinx, is the most precious thing that archaeology has to offer. It is more valuable than gold, more significant than any artifact, more important than any inscription. It is the proof that human beings can create things that endure, things that survive the collapse of civilizations, the extinction of languages, the dissolution of empires, and the slow, patient erosion of time itself. The Sphinx is that proof, and as long as it stands, the connection holds. The Sphinx's eastward gaze carries one final meaning that transcends its original theological context. The Sphinx watches the sunrise. Every morning, for more than 4,500 years, the first light of the Egyptian dawn has fallen on the face of the Sphinx, illuminating the features, warming the stone, recreating, in miniature, the moment when the monument was first revealed in the light of its first morning. The sunrise is the daily resurrection, the daily proof that light returns after darkness, that warmth follows cold, that life persists despite the shadow of death. The Sphinx, watching the sunrise, is the permanent witness to this daily miracle, the figure that has seen more sunrises than any other human creation. This image, the face of the Sphinx illuminated by the rising sun, its features emerging from the shadow of the desert night, is the image that best captures the meaning of the monument and the legacy of the man who probably built it. It is an image of persistence, it is an image of endurance, and it is an image of patience. The patience of stone, the patience of a face that has been watching and waiting for 4,500 years, and that will continue to watch and wait long after we are gone. We have spent tonight with a pharaoh and a sphinx, with a king whose face may be carved into the living rock of the Giza Plateau, and whose identity has been debated for 2 centuries without resolution. We have traced the construction of Khafre's funerary complex, the pyramid, the valley temple, the causeway, the mortuary temple, and the Sphinx itself, as an integrated architectural program designed to enact the theology of royal death and resurrection. We have examined the evidence for and against the attribution of the Sphinx to Khafre, and we have confronted the unsettling reality that the evidence, while suggestive, is not conclusive. And we have considered the Sphinx in the context of colossal guardian figures from other civilizations: the Assyrian Lamasa, the Bamiyan Buddhas, the Abu Simbel Colossi, and found that none of them matches the Sphinx in age, in endurance, or in mystery. What does all of this mean? What does the story of Khafre and the Sphinx tell us about the world we live in today? The first implication concerns the limits of knowledge. We have accumulated more information about the ancient world than any previous generation. We have technologies, satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, muon tomography, carbon dating, DNA analysis that would have seemed miraculous to the archaeologists of a century ago. And yet the most basic question about the most famous monument in the ancient world remains unanswered. The Sphinx's builder is uncertain. The lesson is not that our technologies are inadequate, they are extraordinary. The lesson is that some questions cannot be answered by technology alone. The evidence that would answer the question, a contemporary inscription, an undisturbed archaeological context, an unambiguous textual reference, may not exist, and no amount of technological sophistication can create evidence that was never produced or that has been destroyed by time. The second implication concerns the nature of fame. Khafre is remembered, but he is remembered for something he may not have done. If the Sphinx is his, he is the creator of the most iconic monument in the ancient world. If the Sphinx is not his, he is a pharaoh whose pyramid is often mistaken for someone else's, and whose personal biography is almost entirely blank. The difference between these two Khafres, the builder of the Sphinx and the anonymous pyramid builder, is the difference between one of the most famous figures in ancient history and a footnote. And the difference depends on a question: that may never be answered. This uncertainty is not comfortable. We want to know who built things. We want to assign credit, assign responsibility, assign identity. We want the monuments of the past to have specific authors, just as we want the books we read to have specific writers and the songs we hear to have specific composers. The idea that the most famous sculpture on Earth might have an unknown builder is unsettling. It challenges our assumption that great achievements must be traceable to specific individuals. But the Sphinx suggests otherwise. Great achievements can be anonymous. Great monuments can outlive their creators' identities. Great works of art can survive the loss of attribution without losing their power. The Sphinx is not diminished by the uncertainty about its builder. It is enriched by it. The mystery is part of the monument, an integral component of its identity, as essential to its character as the missing nose or the weathered face. The Sphinx without its mystery would be a different monument, a fully explained artifact, pinned down and classified, its secrets revealed, its enigma dissolved. The Sphinx with its mystery is something more, a reminder that the past is deeper than our ability to understand it, and that the most powerful monuments are the ones that retain their capacity to surprise. The third implication is the most personal. Khafre wanted to be remembered. He built a pyramid, a temple complex, and possibly a colossal portrait of himself carved from the living rock. He invested the full resources of the most powerful state in the ancient world in the project of ensuring his own immortality. And the result, 4,500 years later, is a paradox. He is remembered, but only uncertainly. His name survives, but his person does not. His face may be carved on the Giza Plateau, but we cannot be sure. He is the Pharaoh of the probably, the king whose greatest achievement is qualified by a word that makes certainty impossible. This is a profoundly human situation. All of us want to be remembered. All of us build our monuments, our careers, our families, our works, our contributions, and hope that something will survive us. And all of us face the same reality that Khafre faced. The survival of our legacy is not guaranteed. The things we build may outlast us. But the connection between the builder and the building, the thread that links the person to the product, is fragile. It can be broken by time, by neglect, by the simple accumulation of centuries that separates the creator from the creation. Khafre built for eternity, and eternity, in its impartial way, has preserved his monument while erasing his identity. The Sphinx stands. The man behind it is a ghost, and the question, whose face, echoes across 4,500 years of silence, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The modern world has its own sphinxes, its own monuments whose meaning outlasts their creator's ability to control the interpretation. The Statue of Liberty, conceived as a gift from France celebrating Republican ideals, has become a symbol of immigration and refuge that its creators did not intend. The Washington Monument, designed as a tribute to the first president, has become an icon of American power that transcends its original purpose. Monuments, once erected, acquire meanings that their builders cannot anticipate. They become canvases for the projections of successive generations. Each generation seeing in the stone what it needs to see, reading into the silence what it needs to hear. The Sphinx is the oldest and most extreme example of this process. Built, in all probability, as a portrait of a specific king, it has become something far larger than any individual, a symbol of mystery itself, of the ancient world's capacity to surprise and humble the modern one, of the persistence of questions that resist resolution. Khafre, if he built the Sphinx, could not have anticipated this transformation. He built a portrait. Time made it a symbol, and the symbol has proved more durable than the portrait. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the Khafre story, that the meaning of what we build is not determined by us but by time. We can control the form of our monuments, but not their significance. We can choose what to carve, but not what the carving will come to represent. The Pharaoh carved a face, the world made it a riddle, and the riddle, 4,500 years later, endures. There is a face in the desert east of Cairo. It is carved from the living rock of the Giza Plateau, a ridge of natural limestone shaped by human hands into the form of a creature that does not exist, the body of a lion, the head of a man. It is 73 meters long. It is 20 meters high. It weighs an estimated 200,000 tons. It has been sitting in the same spot, in the same pose, wearing the same expression, for more than 4,500 years. The face is damaged. The nose is missing, broken off, probably in the 14th century, by a man who objected to its existence. The beard has fallen. Fragments of it are in the British Museum and the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The surface is scarred by millennia of wind, sand, rain, and salt. The paint that once coloured the face, red skin, blue and gold headdress, has long since worn away, leaving only bare, weathered limestone, and yet the face endures. Damaged, incomplete, half-eroded, it endures, and in its endurance it speaks. Not in words, the Sphinx has never spoken in words, but in the language of stone, the language of persistence, of patience, of the stubborn refusal to disappear. The man who probably built this face was called Khafre. He was the fourth king of Egypt's Fourth Dynasty. He ruled for roughly 20 years, sometime around 2530 BC. He built a pyramid, the second largest at Giza, often mistaken for the largest because of its higher position on the plateau. He built a valley temple of massive granite blocks containing some of the finest sculpture of the Old Kingdom. He built a causeway, a mortuary temple, and probably, the Sphinx. He did all of this, and then he disappeared. His body was taken from his tomb. His mummy has never been found. His biography is blank. His personality is invisible. The pharaoh who may have carved the most famous face in the ancient world left behind almost no trace of his own face, except, possibly, the colossal one carved from the desert rock. The Sphinx stares east. It has been staring east since the day it was carved. Through the rise and fall of the Old Kingdom, through the New Kingdom, through the Persian and Greek and Roman conquests, through the Arab and Ottoman and British periods, through the birth of modern Egypt and the construction of modern Cairo, it has watched the entire history of the world since the Bronze Age unfold before its eyes, and it has not blinked, not flinched, not turned away. The face may be Khafre's. The evidence suggests it is. The majority of scholars accept the attribution, but the certainty that would settle the question beyond dispute has not been achieved, and may never be, and perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the most famous face in the ancient world should belong to someone we cannot quite identify. Perhaps the greatest monument should carry the deepest mystery. Perhaps the Sphinx, in keeping its silence about its builder, is teaching us the final lesson about the relationship between human beings and the things they create, that the creation outlasts the creator, that the monument survives the man, and that the face carved in stone endures, long after the name behind it has faded into uncertainty. The desert is quiet at Giza in the small hours of the morning. The tourists are gone, the vendors have packed up, the buses have departed, and the Sphinx sits alone in its enclosure, surrounded by the pyramids of three forgotten kings, staring east toward a sunrise it has witnessed more than 1,600,000 times. One more sunrise will not change anything. The face will still be weathered, the nose will still be missing, the mystery will still be unsolved, but the Sphinx will still be watching, as it has watched for 4,500 years, as it will watch for 4,500 more. Khafre, the pharaoh linked to the Great Sphinx, the man behind the face, probably, and in that irreducible, permanent, 4,500-year-old uncertainty, lies the most human truth of all. We build for eternity, but we do not control what eternity remembers. The face stares east, the stone endures, the silence holds, and somewhere beneath the silence, beneath the layers of sand and limestone and 4,500 years of accumulated mystery, lies the truth. The truth about who carved the Sphinx, the truth about whose face it wears, the truth about what it meant to the people who made it, and what it cost them in labour, in stone, and in the relentless expenditure of human effort. That truth exists. It existed once as knowledge, as the shared understanding of a civilization that knew who built its monuments and why. That knowledge has been lost. The monuments remain. The knowledge does not, but the search continues. The archaeologists continue to dig. The geologists continue to analyze. The scholars continue to debate. And the Sphinx continues to sit in its enclosure, facing east, patient and imperturbable, while the centuries accumulate around its pores like sand. The face is Khafre's, probably. The monument is Egypt's, certainly. and the mystery belongs to all of us, to every person who has ever looked at the Sphinx and felt, in the pit of their stomach, the weight of 4,500 years of unanswered questions. That weight is not a burden, it is a gift. The Sphinx gives us the gift of uncertainty, the gift of knowing that the world is older than our understanding of it, deeper than our ability to measure it, and more mysterious than our capacity to explain it. In a world that craves certainty, the Sphinx offers something better: wonder. And wonder, unlike certainty, never grows old.